Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this installment of Conscious Conversations featuring people like me who are part of the mental health therapist team at Nashville Emotional Wellness. My name is Mellissa Gordon, and today I'm joined by Jack Simon. We're so excited to spend this time with you today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jack Simon, and today we'll be unpacking the topic of resiliency. Conscious conversations are intended to educate, uplift, and provide guidance on how to deal with life stressors. Our motto at New is real people helping real people with real problems. And these conversations are an opportunity to talk with our therapists. So let's dive in. So Mellissa, our topic today, as I mentioned, is resiliency, which I think is a term often used pretty freely, both in therapeutic context, in non-therapeutic context. And in fact, it's used so much that sometimes the definition of it is evolving and changing and growing. So I think that's a pretty strong place to start as far as when you hear the concept of resiliency, when you hear the word, what comes to mind for you as far as definition?
Sure. I think about someone's ability to someone's ability to respond positively to any kind of setback or barrier. I'm a big believer in it's not what happens to us in this world, it's how we respond or react,
Mm,
right? And I think that's why it's really up to clinicians to really support people in being resilient. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we forget the difference between responding and reacting,
mm,
So I think about a reaction is just maybe someone's not emotionally regulated. And so, you may respond with anger or may respond with, some maladaptive behavior, meaning like negative strategies of coping, substance abuse, and things like that. But I think we live in a world where there's so many opportunities where we can work with clients around choosing how to respond
mm.
and helping them come up with like almost in a way a toolkit of healthy responses to society, to any crisis that could exist. That comes to my mind. It's around choosing how to respond.
Yeah. I like that concept of choice and that concept of intentionality. And that's really where, therapeutically, I like the idea of like I decide where I go. I decide what happens to me. And when I think of this definition of resilience, it's not so much the sense of like, oh, I can deal with difficult things. It's that these things have happened to me, but I am choosing to move forward and I'm using these things as opportunities for growth, right? So it's not so much an obstacle of I can't do this, this, and this. It's these terrible things occurred, and I'm leaning into the fact that I decide what happens moving forward. And it's one of those things that unfortunately we get good at it by having not so great things come to us, right? So I like this idea of taking the not so great and using that as a launching pad as opposed to an obstacle. Because we have enough that's an obstacle, right? Enough things are happening that are obstacles. What does it look like to take that as an opportunity and then to build that into a regular practice so that if these things happen again, I can move forward with intentionality. So that's kind of how I see it as far as a concept. When you're working with your clients, when you're working with larger organizations, right? How might you how do you encounter this, right? How does resiliency show up in the therapy space? How does it show up in the networking, more macro spaces, where you as a professional come in and kind of like identify it and then decide how you want to move forward with it?
Sure. So when I think about in systems that, and I'm really big on, and part of this work, when I think about a client's ability to have improve their navigational capital, what I mean by that is someone's ability to move through different systems successfully. I think part of that is around working with, universities, working in different school systems and different organizations, even for-profit companies around being real intentional on creating empathy and how do we support and
Mm,
foster empathy? Because I think no matter what, if a workplace is not paying attention to the emotional intelligence and needs of clients, of coworkers, of, uh, people who may be contracting services, they're doing a disservice. I think
Mhm.
everything comes down to relationships. And part of a key thing to a strong relationship is being able to have some perspective taking and making
Mm.
sure that we have opportunity and space where someone can express a full range of emotions. And I think that's what happens to people is that we get so caught up in this is your box, and you have to
Mm.
stay there, that we forget that we can show what's called, we all have a range of affects. There's a researcher, Thompson, that said everyone has 9 affects. And what that means is 9 responses to stimuli, and they range from negative to positive. And I think in society, it tells us so much. We have to always operate in those positive affects. So feeling happy, loving surprise, and things like that. But what about disgust or
Mhm.
overwhelm, those negative emotions? But I think it comes down to what are we doing to support people's capacity to express a full range of emotions? Because I think sometimes we get all these messages around you have to stay in those top three,
Yeah.
top four. You can't even be in the neutral, right? You gotta move to the top four. And that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
That's a lot of pressure. And I think it wasn't until COVID to where people really start getting around to being what I would say in quotations pro therapy, right? Like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, we all had this national pandemic, even
Yeah.
locally. I think about, the tornadoes and the devastation, or even the bombing that happened here in Nashville, Tennessee. And I think now people are like, oh yeah, let's get some therapy. Let's work on our
Yeah.
locus of control, and let's work on internal being intrinsically motivated and things like that. That comes to mind too, just being aware of like where we are in society. Any
Yeah.
thoughts about anything I mentioned?
Well, there's a lot, right? So I'm spot on. I love that concept, like the full range of affect, right? The full range of it. And then how you're saying this idea around, we're supposed to be in those tops. We're supposed to be happy. We're supposed to be that. And just how insincere that is, but not only insincere, but dangerous, right? I don't believe that there are good emotions or bad emotions. There are emotions, and what you do with them impacts how it affects you, right? We need disgust. We need shame. If you are looking back at that thing you did in 3rd grade and you just cringe thinking about it, that's good because it shows that you've learned and then you've grown, right? We need to look back at those things that we're not proud of and identify that as disgust, right? We need to get angry. People
Mhm.
change the world because they're angry, right? We need to feel sad. If we have a relationship that ends, we need to give ourselves the space to be sad around that. Because if we don't, right, as we know, it's going to stay in the body and show up whenever it wants. But we're also not being honest with ourselves, right? And if we try to pretend that it's not an issue, not only are we denying that, but we're missing the opportunity to grow, right? So I don't want everything to be happy all the time. I don't want everything to be joyous. And that's not my goal for my own personal self. And it's not my goal for the clients that I work with, because that's just not how life works. Things are difficult, things are hard. And when we bring in this idea of resiliency, of like moving forward with it, the only way we can get better at it is if we acknowledge it for what it is. Right. So if I really, really wanted this job, right? I really wanted it, and I thought I was going to get it and everything lined up, and I didn't get the job, right? If I don't feel that sadness, if I just kind of go, whatever, no big deal, I don't care, right? One, I'm like lying to myself and I'm letting things fester. But two, I'm missing the opportunity to say, okay, what about it do I think was not the fit, right? Could I have done something differently? Can I use this opportunity moving forward? But I can only do that if I'm authentic with it, right? So when we talk about it showing up in the therapy space, showing up in the macro space, in the system space, what I see often is these folks that have just had such a raw deal thrown to them. It's crisis after crisis after crisis. And it's this sense of, can't things just be easy, right? And it's like, yeah, wouldn't that be great? But here's where we are, right? So I practice a lot of acceptance and commitment therapy. Acceptance isn't good or bad, it means that it is. And I say a lot, what's happening to you, your reality might not be your fault, but it is your problem.
Mm.
And if I can get to a space where I own that, if I can get to a space where I say, this is what's going on, this is what I have control over, this is what I don't, here's what I choose to do moving forward, that to me is where the resiliency piece shows up. I
Mm.
go from being this kind of passive on the side of, oh, these things are happening, there's nothing I can do, to these things are happening, there are some things I can't do, but here's what I'm choosing to do. And the more that I do that, the stronger that resiliency becomes. I have young children, and I hear people talk often about, I just want to create a world for my kid that's free of pain and free of strife. And I don't want them to have to deal with these things. And I'm like, no, 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 no. I want them to, but I want them to be prepared to deal with it, because that's how they learn and that's how they grow.
Mm.
I need my kid to fall and skin his knee so he knows, hey, maybe next time don't run, right?
Mm.
What I do see, though, often is the people and groups that have the awareness of it, and it's exhausting, right? I'm tired of being resilient, right? I'm tired of this happening. So I think it's important for us as clinicians to actively hold that empathy, right? And let's sit with it and let's see where we want to do with it and what we want to lean into. Okay, and now where do you want to go?
Sure, sure. I thinking about, everything that you said, I think about, I hate to use the word trait, but I think about, so what does a resilient person do?
Mm,
Some of the things that come to mind, maybe they're really good at communicating, right? And so communicating that range of emotions that we talked about, right? Um, Perhaps they may have high emotional intelligence, so just this awareness of what's going, how they're responding, how they're reacting, how does it feel in their bodies, right? And sitting with it. I like the point, like it's not about, oh, I'm going to skip over this emotion, but instead I'm going to work through it. I think there's a difference. Um, what else comes to mind? Maybe viewing themselves as, a survivor and not a victim. Because,
mm,
we'll talk maybe later on about that difference between a survivor's mentality and a victim mentality. Where one I think is rooted in strength. The other is, oh, this thing happened to me. Woe, it's me. Right. And I think
mm-hmm.
that it's healthy to sit in that space of this thing happened to me and I'm sad and feel the feelings, but like work, we have to get to a place, and that's where we come in as
Yeah,
clinicians to help people work through it and then move from that space. And that could be like 10 sessions to move from
yeah.
victim mentality to survivor mentality. Any thoughts about when you think about what does a resilient person do?
Yeah, I think one of the difficult things about that is, and I'm just smiling now when you talk about that 10 session piece, man, don't I wish I could give you a pill and everything is perfect. That's just not how this works. But what I like about it is the beauty of the journey, like allowing it to happen, right? But the question of like, what do resilient people do? One of the difficult things about this, and I think it's a lot of things that happen in mental health, is that it's not so much a response in crisis, it's an active preparation when and not, right?
Mm.
I've got to be doing this work when I'm feeling good, when I'm feeling ready, so that if I need to do it, my body already knows how, right? So a resilient person, a person who's going to exude resiliency, is going to have an understanding of what their values are and what they do to lean into them, right? If I can focus on the value of what I'm doing, not so much the act of what I'm doing, but why I'm doing it, it gives me that framework to be in integrity with my true self, right? And if I know what that North Star is for me, let's say that value is community, let's say that value is religion, let's say that value is family, whatever it may be, if I've got my North Star, that gives me the framework to base my actions. So what does resiliency look like? It looks like someone who's asking the questions not so much on why, what am I doing, but why am I doing it? And does that make sense for me? Right. So that's like step one, I think. The other piece you mentioned is just that highly emotional intelligence piece. I like to play around with this idea of noticing a lot, right? It's not that I'm depressed, I'm noticing being depressed. It's not that I'm enraged, I'm noticing feeling this enragement. The key here is that we're separating ourselves from the emotion. We're separating ourselves from the experience. It's something happening that doesn't define all of us, because we're never just one thing, right? It's something that's happening that we are witnessing or a part of, and then we decide how we move through it. So a resilient person has the ability to first feel what that feels like physically in their body. What am I experiencing? And then decide, okay, how does that fit in to my larger goal, my larger value? And then what can I do to kind of make it get there? A resilient person has boundaries, right? They've got an understanding of what their boundaries and limits are, and they're in the sense of what they control, right? So the boundary is not, you don't get to talk to me about that. The boundary is, if you choose to talk to me about that, I will choose to leave, right? It's in their own realm. And it all comes back to the point that you brought up initially, that intentionality, that choice. Resilient people do not avoid distress.
Mm-hmm.
Resilient people do not turn away from something because it's a pain. Now, they don't seek out pain, right? They're not sadistic, but they don't turn away from distress if it's in line with their larger values, right? So they have this justification for, yes, this is hard. Yes, this is difficult, but I'm doing it because X, Y, Z, and that X, Y, Z lines up with who they are. So when we think about what does it look like, what does it show up like, it's a maintenance, right? It's a day-to-day check-in on who am I, what do I care about, and am I living towards that? And sometimes it's a little more informal than others, but sometimes I think it really is either in the mirror or in the journal. What do I care about? And am I leaning into that? And if I find that incongruency, if I find that spot where I say I like XYZ, but I'm not doing it, what's step one, right? And they're asking those questions as opposed to waiting to be told, right? There's that active piece.
Sure. When you're kind of identifying what does a resilient person do, I also think about a resilient person really practices self-compassion too, right? Kind of relates to that whole mental toughness. Part of that too is we live in a world that's so easy to give compassion to things that are outside of you. What about for yourself? You know, giving yourself grace. I think that's part of this work too, right? Any thoughts about that? You seem like you kind of had a reaction when I said that.
I did, because it's so easy. And you know, we sit here in our roles, right? And we empower all day. We empower all day. We hold that mirror up, and then we forget. I forget, right? Let me speak for myself here sometimes, that I need to turn that mirror internally, and give myself some grace with these difficult things. And I think that that might be a nice, clear separation between someone who is resilient and someone who is just kind of really good at getting punched. Someone who's resilient is going to give themselves permission to let it be a process. They're going to acknowledge that. They're going to acknowledge the step at a time, and they're going to acknowledge that they're not always going to be successful. Versus someone who's getting punched. I've been punched before. I'll be fine. I've done it again, right? But if I'm not saying, man, it sucks that I was punched, right? Man, it's really okay that it's taken me a while to get back up. I'm skipping that step, right? I'm skipping that step and acknowledging it. And you know what I'm kind of coming to as I talk to you about this is that by skipping that step, I'm missing the opportunity for the growth.
Sure.
Right? I'm placating. I'm keeping it safe. I'm keeping it stable. And sometimes, by the way, that's what we need. Right? Sometimes we're not in a space to kind of do the deep growing, but that's not where we learn.
Sure. And also, I think it's around too doing that thing that's challenging, getting outside of your comfort zone. And it's not easy. We live, and it's not norm that we have self-compassion and think about grace and what does it mean to also, I think it's, when it comes down to it, it's a part of really loving ourselves, right? That's part of this work and being resilient. It's part of loving yourself, having those hard conversations, facing the thing, and not letting whatever the thing is, whether the thing is a bad relationship, challenges at work, all these things, not letting it live and be that elephant in the room that you avoid, or the elephant in the room that you try to just paint a different color. It's still an elephant, right? Until you face it. And so it's also, I think, it's really connected to self-love, because self-love means that you're going to turn and you're going to face that thing that's that maybe it's been keeping you up at night or
Yeah.
keeping you from focusing at work. It's that thing that may be keeping you from doing your best, right? And I think it also connects to self-doubt, which, you know, can be really, really hard to say, hey, this is who I am. I'm going to stand in who I am, have it be firm, and continue to walk towards being the best person I can be. And I feel like I'm saying that to clients.
Yeah.
Sometimes I got to say that to myself too, right?
Totally. Totally. Real people helping real people. I hear that idea of that self-love and that self-worth, right? And when we think about, some of the more classic symptoms we see in cases of trauma, right? This is my fault. Of course it happened to me. I deserve this, right? So right off the bat, that gives me as a clinician a space to start playing around and saying, well, let's talk about where that comes from, right? And can we possibly challenge that? Because it is about, I deserve to be better. I deserve to move forward. I deserve to kind of take that next step and take ownership. And when I can do that and give myself permission to want to do it, right? That's where that resiliency kind of builds in, because I've determined that it's worth doing. I've determined that I am worth having that happen. And it's so easy for us to say, and it's so hard to do, right? Especially when you've had those thoughts just banging and banging and banging. And we almost, when it goes on long enough, we forget what it's like to not have them there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So as we kind of talk about this, we start to see this kind of web of potential start popping up of like, all right, how do we want to go about this? Do we want to start talking about the kind of core symptoms happening? Do we want to talk about what might be contributing it? And then how can we kind of tie it all together to say, okay, now where do you want to go next? Where can we find those nuggets of learning to move forward in?
Sure, sure. And that makes me think about part of facing that thing. It's also maybe as it relates to what I'm saying around self-compassion is especially when times are hard, it's when people treat themselves with kindness, right? Which is not easy. It may be easier to do those maladaptive things, but it's like, no, let's norm a different way of being. It makes me wonder for you when you think about promoting resiliency in a therapeutic environment. What are some of your go-tos or strategies that have been effective for you?
I think I as much as I can tie it back into values, I try to do, because I truly believe that gives us the context of the individual separation of this is why I'm doing it and this is me. I really appreciate interventions, processes, frameworks that highlight the individual uniqueness of the person, right? And that there is no cookie cutter way to experience. So, when I talk about building resilience with the client or identifying it with the client, right? We want to start with where there are evidence of it, right? Tell me the hard things that you've done. Tell me the things that you've done that you didn't think you could do, right? Let's start there. Can we draw some parallels? Tell me something that you thought was going to be really hard, but you actually crushed it. What about that happened, right? So we start pulling from these examples, and it's really important to do this because especially when our thought content goes wherever it goes, right? Now we're outside of the world of data. Now we're just like pure conjecture. Well, what about this? Well, what about this? So if we can challenge those thoughts with the pieces of data that says, actually, the data says I could do X, Y, Z, and I've done X, Y, Z. Now we're dealing with a situation where we have something to pull from, right? Now we're factually, you did this. Okay, what do we think is getting in the way from it doing again, right? What are the similarities? What are the differences? And now, how does this all tie to what's important to you, right? And there's so many times that I'll speak with people who are just so worked up over something that they don't actually care about. They think they're supposed to care about it, right? The people in their life are telling them to care about it. Their boss is telling them, their wife is telling them, they're saying, this is what I should be doing. I need the job, I need the house, I need the family. They don't actually care. And when they give themselves permission to disengage from that, right? Oh, what I actually value is this. Now these little things don't bother me as much anymore because I'm moving in that direction. So I really try to tie it into that component. I think, journaling is a huge tool for this. And there's a couple different ways I encourage people to journal. There are some folks that I'll tell them, whatever comes, just get it out. Don't even think about it. And when you finish, rip it up and throw it away. Just give yourself the space to get it out, right? There are some folks that I tell the exact opposite, right? Put it down, come back in 20 minutes, look at it, piece through it, find your things on it. But something happens in that act of brain to pen. If I can just look at it and see it, right? If I can see it and know my own handwriting, you want to try something hard, look directly into a mirror, look into your eyes and say, I love you. It's one of the hardest things you can do, right? It seems so simple, but that courage to see myself for what's actually happening and what's going on. And maybe we'll try that, right? Maybe I'll hold it up and I'll say that you love yourself right now. Okay, I don't really know how I feel. Well, what do you feel? Where do you feel it, right? Can we process through the physical side of it? What about yourself? Like, what are some common go-tos or strategies you employ when engaging in this concept?
Sure. I'm similar to you because my background in writing and as a poet, so definitely we may read a stanza from a poem and talk about kind of analyze it, may use that as kind of a writing prompt based on their own lived experience. I know some tools that have been really effective for me is I have people write their essentialized life story in 24 words, right? And of course,
Stuff.
eventually we get it down to one word. And I've had sessions so where we focus on why that one word was their word for like 4 sessions. And what does it mean, or what kind of transformation or what different actions are needed so that word is something different, right? Because maybe that word is like, oh, I don't want that to be my legacy, right? And so I think I do a lot of work around also that, and then also looking at events, because a lot of this work, when you think about resiliency, is how you respond to things that are external, right? And so we might look at and examine people's responses to different events and why did they respond that way, or looking at things, even some stuff you did successfully, why was that successful but then this other situation was not. Other things to think about. I also have them look at their networks, because sometimes the networks they're in are contributing to the stress or the crisis that exists. What does it mean to also face fear in different ways? And then how do you define your fears, right? And really doing some deep work related to like narrative therapy around what is their fear and how can they face it. Other things to come up. I talked about social support a little bit. But no, also I haven't done it in years, but I used to do motivational speaking. And one of the talks that I do is called Circles of Influence. And so sometimes we don't just not aware that our circles, like, everybody doesn't really need to be there. Or there's some people in your circle, maybe they've been there past their time, right? And so how that could be energy draining for you as well. But really trying to connect people to purpose and growth when it comes down to, I know you mentioned values, and what does it mean to really go back to the life that you want to live? Why are you not making actions towards the life you want to live, and making sure people move from this like complacency feel, and I think part of that work too is connecting that difference between, a survivor mentality and a victim mentality, right? Because to me, a victim mentality is very much, this happened to me, this is why this happened to me over and over again. But instead of saying this happened to me, like, oh, this happened to me and I am X because of it. And like, I've grown, right? It goes back to what we talked about earlier on choosing how to respond and not react.
So you mentioned that language switch, right? And it's more just a language switch. It's an idea switch between that victim and survivor mentality. And I think this is a really good place for us to kind of pick up on. We're going to need to pause for just a second for some technical fixes, and then we'll be right back to pick up on that. Don't go anywhere. All right, so we are back. Thank you all for your patience there. And where we left things was this kind of distinction between that survivor mentality and victim mentality. So what are your kind of thoughts on that, and kind of where do you take it?
So I think that, again, when I think about a victim mentality, people get kind of fixed and stuck on this thing happened to me, and that's why I have this outcome. This other thing happened to me, that's why I have this outcome, you know? And yes, things happen to us, and sometimes undeservingly, right? But again, going back to what we we're talking about before, we have the choice to choose how we respond, right? And so when I think about the difference between maybe a victim's mentality and a survivor's mentality, is that a survivor from like, look what I've been through, and
Mm.
I'm still here.
Mm-hmm.
This shaped my perspective. I went through that, and I'm better because of, right?
Mm.
I think maybe a survivor is able to look at different things and decisions that they made, and not being in a place of regret, but instead, oh, this sharpened my saw, or this shaped my cultural lens in a way, or this brought me closer to my family, or this gave me a better understanding on how, I can apply self-compassion into my
Mm.
life, or this strengthened my commitment to a value, right? I think that's the difference between a victim's mentality and a survivor's mentality.
Yeah.
What would you say would be the
I,
difference?
well, you're hitting on it. It's that choice. I am choosing to acknowledge, right? And that's another piece. And then the way you're describing it, you're saying this sense of like, oh, this thing happened to me. It's not, oh, woe was me, but I'm seeing that it happened and I'm choosing to move forward. But the piece before that is I have to acknowledge it was what it was.
Mm-hmm.
Right? A survivor mentality acknowledges the fact that I survived something. I didn't just say, oh, it's not that big of a deal. Oh, write it off. I am seeing it for what it is, and I'm acknowledging the pain that was there. Right?
Sure.
So many individuals, whether consciously or not, are in a spot where these experiences they've had, they don't really grasp the full intensity of it. Right? Oh, well, it wasn't that big of a deal, or everyone was doing it, or it was fine. Right? So step one is like acknowledging this is what happened, and this is how it made me feel then, and this is how it makes me feel now. Right? That emotional intelligence, and sitting with it and processing it fully. Okay, now I've done that, I'm deciding I want to move forward. I'm not going
Sure.
to let this be my defining bit. I'm not going to have it happen. The stereotypical, weird uncle who, always talks about his glory days in high school. If coach just would have put me in, Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite, right? If they just would have put me back in that game, everything would have happened, right? Like, can I acknowledge what really happened? And then can I make the choice to move forward? And I also, as I, again, these are things I say a lot, like it's very easy for us to say and very hard to do. Sometimes we really do need to sit with it for a while. Right. And sometimes we really do, when you lose a loved one, right? There's this, and especially as we come up, I'm not sure when this is going to air, but like we're coming up around the holidays, right? And one of the major themes we see around the holidays is just this grief that just comes with it, because Nana's not here anymore, or because, this year my parents got divorced and I have to go to two things, right? And things are different. And it's just like, okay, well, you can spend your time, if you choose, sitting in that what if, and maybe you need to, right? Maybe you do really need to. I hear a lot in like grief cases, people saying like, I think it's just too early for me to laugh about this. It's like, okay, that's where you are. That's where you are. How is that serving you? Right? What is the benefit it's bringing you? And then where do you really want to go?
Sure.
And that's really hard, right? So when we like framing it back in resiliency, framing it back in this kind of survivor mentality, the intentionality is needed to pull the lesson to create the strength. Right? I've got to choose to say, I got to choose to do, this is what I'm taking away from this. Right? This is how I'm going to use this moving forward. It can be tempting to just kind of put it in a box in the corner. Like, I'm done with it. I'm not going to deal with it. I don't want to think about it. Don't want to have it happen. Right. I've definitely done that a few times in my life. I worked for a big box realtor, where I was one of a billion people, and I was not stoked with the way things were, but I needed a job, needed a thing, have it happened. I was working on the floor and got a phone call. I shouldn't have had my phone, by the way, but I did, from another job that I wanted more. They said, hey, Jack, you got the job. I literally dropped my work belt on the ground and just walked out the door. Just completely walked, didn't do anything, nothing, just totally left. And like, teenage angsty me was like, yeah, I'm sticking it to it. But I missed an opportunity. I missed a tremendous opportunity to do the difficult thing, have the conversation with the employer and say, listen, I don't like X, Y, and Z. Here's where I'm going because of it. And that could have allowed me the chance to really process what it meant to be dissatisfied and move forward, as opposed to, this is uncomfortable now, let me just dive into it. Right. And that's a pretty low scale stressor, right? I talk a lot in this work, especially in like group settings, like I'm going to use a really soft example, right? Really soft, but the parallels for real life and heavy life are there, and, content warning for folks who may be listening, right? Let's say you get out of an abusive relationship, right? There's an argument to be said that I've got to accept that thing happened, right? Not that it was good, right? Not that I want to do it again, but I've got to say that's what happened. And here's how it affected me. Okay. Now I've got to make the choice on how I want to move forward with it. What can I pull from this? What can I take from this that allows me to be one step closer to my overall value goal? And I can't do that if I just get up and leave, pretend it didn't happen, walk away from it, because I missed that opportunity to pull it, right? So being a survivor is about acknowledging this is what I survived from, and this is how I'm going to make it better, as opposed to a victim, which is I can't do this, I can't do that because of X, Y, Z.
Yeah, it makes me think about hearing you say that. Thank you. Those are important frames, and for modeling vulnerability as well, right?
Low stakes, but yeah.
I think about a resilient person does two things. One, in terms of skills, stress management and adaptive strategies. So stress management being, when, different tools or strategies someone may use to kind of reduce any negative impacts of stress, right? So that could look like, hey, exercise routine or my diet or, other healthy habits, because we all know that the mind and the body have a connection, right? The other, when I think about adaptive strategies, it may mean offering a different tool. It may mean that you change some different patterns in your system. It may mean you change your social networks. I mean, a number of things. And I feel like those two things come to mind. But when I think about my lived experience, because, disclaimer, I have survived a lot of emotional, physical, sexual abuse, right? And that's part of one of those things that kind of made me want to do this work. And I think that, when I think about for myself, in terms of a time where I learned resiliency, I think it was just through my own journey of being aware of something different that I'd never advocated for before. And what I mean by that is, so my background is economic and racial justice, very tunnel vision about those two things, still seeing things through a somewhat intersectional lens, but I became disabled in a car accident for a couple of years. And through that lived experience, realized I had never considered advocating for or working in the disability community until I had to have my own awareness around overcoming and being differently abled as an adult, a young adult, right? And I think that sometimes, I'm not saying that we all need these traumatic events for us to get intersectionality, to get perspective taking, to really understand resilience in a different way. What I mean by that, I think going back to what we talked about earlier, I think it really connected me to being able to express and feel and share a full range of emotions, and knowing like I need that from people. That's part of my, if there is such a thing, kind of like my friend checklist. If I can't be quiet with you, if I can't have a full range of emotions, you probably don't really need to be in my life, right? Because my lived experience, people only wanted that happy-go-lucky Mellissa, life of the party part of me. No, you get all of me, right? And if I can't have all of me present, I don't need to be in those spaces. I don't need those people in my life.
Yeah, and I so appreciate your truth, Mellissa. And it's an honor to hear it, and it's also an honor to kind of see how you're this living example of like, yeah, these things are awful, right? But it provides me with this opportunity to understand, one, myself, but then two, how that experience fits into the larger piece of the world, right? We are so, for better or for worse, right? We see the world through our two eyes. And based on what's been in front of your two eyes is going to inform the way that you see these things. And you mentioned, I hadn't thought about this until I was in the position, right? And while we preach this idea of, compassion, understanding, and this universal experiences, in my, unscientific judgment, I think that's how most people get passionate about stuff. That something happens to them or someone they know. It's these things that are theoretically they're aware of, right? They know that they're happening in the world, but now it happens close, and now I really got to rev it up, right? So, gun violence is an excellent example of this, right? So many people, no big deal, no big deal. And it happens in their community, and in that community, let's localize, let's get ready, let's do it, right? Even though we know consciously in our minds, these things are happening all the time, but now it's happening to me. People that have extreme faith, very heavy into their spirituality and their religion, they know these things are happening in the world. Then someone in their family passes away. I don't understand how God could do this, right? That dissonance, right? That we know it's happening, but when it happens to us, all of a sudden things change. And what you so beautifully spoke about is feeling it for what it is, and then seeing it as the opportunity to not only serve myself, but those around me. Right now, I'm one more ambassador for people in those spots to say, hey, this is an experience you can have, right? And then taking that and saying, now that I've done that and learned what it looks like in this area, can I expand that to other components? So yes, now I'm expanding it to my social circle and saying, I've had something happen to me that forced me to look into the uglier parts of myself. And now that I've done that, I've learned to appreciate that full affect. And I'm going to choose to surround myself with people that appreciate that as well, right? Now, I think there's a separate conversation we can have about, do you have to have full affect with everyone in your life, right? But that's the thing you can play with, because sometimes you need just a person to, just shoot it with and whatever, but you're the one making that choice, right? And arguably, at least in this case, from what I'm hearing, the way that you made that choice is because you were forced to, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want a world free of distress, and I don't want these things to happen.
Sure.
But if they're going to happen, right? And again, most of this is out of you would have the perfect, most just society where everybody does everything great and everyone's fantastic, and a hurricane sweeps through, right? Life happens. If this is going to be happening, can I make the intentional choice to move forward with it, as opposed to sticking in the what if? So how do we practice it, right? How do we do it? And I think this is a good way for us to kind of pivot into some of those strategies or ideas and resources that we might have come across. One thing that I definitely want to get the ball started with, if folks are unfamiliar, there's a website called Positive Psychology. It has a number of fantastic resources, both for mental health professionals, but really geared towards individuals experiencing these things. And they have a whole list of resilience activities, journal prompts, daily gratitude practices, daily kind of wellness checks. You'll notice with these things, most of them are geared towards finding a way to make this a practice, a regular piece, as opposed to a crisis response. And one of the journal entries that I like a lot is this one that's going to ask you, it's called Closed Door. All right. Pick a time where a door closed, where something ended or didn't go the way you wanted. Lean into that. How did it feel? What was it like? Now think about what doors opened because of that. Think about what doors happened. So my wife and I have been happily married for a number of years. There was a period of time where we were not married. We were dating. That sounds very profound. But in that process, life was calling us in different directions. And I really wanted to go one way and she wanted to go another. And we decided that we're going to kind of take a break for it. And then life happened. And then we come back and I was like, I really need you in my life. I really want to do this. I really want to make it happen. And I was expecting her to say, of course. And she said, no. She said, I'm not ready right now. I don't want to do it. And I was crushed, like crushed. But because that door closed, I then drove across the country, spent 2 years of my life in California, finding out who I am, deciding what I want to do, creating friends of a lifetime. And I wouldn't trade that for anything. And because those experiences that I had out there, that growth, that search, and that understanding, I became a more true version of myself. When I figured out that true version of myself, I was able to present that to her in a way with like, hey, this is what you're really dealing with, right? This is where we really are. And that kind of gave her the heads up, like, maybe I do want to spend my life with this person. And then a couple of years later, we got married, right? So, but I needed that rejection. I needed that opportunity for her to say no, and for me to kind of do my own thing. That door open to come back and have what I really wanted. If I look back, would I have liked to not been dumped and not feel that pain? Definitely. But I'm so grateful for the door that it opened.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much. And it sounds like also, again, thank you for modeling some transparency and vulnerability and just talk about your journey. It sounds like also you probably leaned into self-compassion as well as self-acceptance, right? And to go back and to present this greater informed, probably rooted version of yourself to your now wife. That's great. So when I think about some resources, a couple of things come to mind. One is I'm really big, especially right now, into somatics and like things in your body. There's a great series by, her name is Angie. It's a YouTube series where she does yoga as well as some work around restorative yoga, and then also I really feel like it's yoga with meditations, right?
Can
And there are a
you
number
can you explain somatics real quick for folks that are unfamiliar with that term?
Sure. When we think about somatics, it's really about like what are you feeling and how does it show up in your body, right? So it's one thing to just name and say, oh, I'm sad. But then like how does it show up in your body? Or I'm anxious. And when I get anxious in my body, my heart beats 80 times more a minute. I'm short of breath, etc. And so being aware, because the mind and the body are connected, and just having some awareness or a hyper awareness around how your feelings and emotions impact your body and regulation, because they're all related. So one of the things, I'm also a licensed yoga teacher. And so when I do with clients, sometimes doing sessions, we may do a little yoga nidra, and that's really around calming the nervous system. There's also a great series, if you just Google yoga nidra for the nervous system, so many prompts will come up and you can just practice this on your own, where it's really someone walking you through and guiding you through a full body scan, or it might be yoga for mindfulness, yoga nidra for mindfulness. There's so many prompts out there that I've utilized and my clients have utilized that are just great for calming the nervous system. Because sometimes we need to just do just that. Then we can think about some adaptive strategies once we're regulated, right? And then as a poet and a writer, like often will create different prompts around, different emotions. One that's been pretty successful is I have a series around hope, and particularly, hope eating itself, right? And so just imagine, right? Tell me about a time when hope ate itself. And it's like, right? That's pretty powerful. Or tell me about a time when hope didn't eat itself and you thought it would, or just looking at hope in different ways. It just opens people up to this different, a greater self-awareness and looking at emotions and events in a different way. And in the day, hey, you thought hope ate itself, but you're still here. That means what? The strength you had today is still there. Let's do some work around your ability to tap into that strength on a more regular basis, right? So those are just some basic tools that come to mind in this moment.
Yeah, I agree so much in that, like the somatic piece of like, let's get you and your body on the same page before we bring our brain into it. Sure. Because if our body is not regulated, our brain is not thinking clearly, period. Sure. Right. So it's not so much about making the decision, it's about getting myself ready to make the decision, right? And that starts with the body. I think it's also important for us to really kind of emphasize like where that line is when it's time to bring a professional in, right? Because these daily like you don't need a master's degree, you don't need a state license to wake up in the morning and practice gratitude, right? These things can happen I think the decision when it's time to kind of reach out, I like to say it, is when we think about quality of life and we think about functionality and where I want to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I am not living a life that aligns with my values and I don't know where to start, right? That's when we can come in, right? Or if I thought my values were at a certain place and I keep doing it, but I'm still unfulfilled, that's where bringing that professional in. And for those who are either newer to therapy or unsure about it, I always say, like, you're the ones that do the work, we hold the mirror up, right? So if you're in a spot where you're hearing this concept of resiliency and you're hearing the sense of like finding a way to move forward, finding a way to pull strength and take with it an intentionality, and you're going, I don't think I've ever done that before, that's a pretty good sign, right? That it might be helpful to bring someone in. But I do want to stress that a lot of this work can be done individually, right?
Sure.
You got to know how to be honest with yourself, though. And I think a lot of the work that happens for individuals in therapy, especially folks who are new to it, is learning what it means to be honest with ourselves, learning what that feels like, right? And sitting with it. Because once I'm honest with myself about kind of either what has happened or where I want to go with it, then I can start deciding realistically what that work wants to be. So it's different for everyone, right? In the context of resiliency, I would want to stress, it's our job as mental health professionals to kind of let you see the things that we're seeing, right? Let you be aware of the stuff that we're having and help empower you with the tools to kind of lean into them fully.
Sure. 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 Well, I think that we talked a lot about resilience, but I also think it's important for anyone listening that I go back to that self-compassion piece. And what does it mean to model, center, and really practice self-compassion? Not just during times of resilience, but all times, because in the day, the grace that we give others so easily, we have to learn how to give to ourselves and norm it.
And one of my favorite groups that I do is on this. If we have the ability to extend compassion, right? If we can be compassionate to others, if we can be empathetic towards others, if we can hold space in our heart for others, then we have data that tells us our brain and our body is capable of compassion. We have the ability to do it. What we might need is some assistance in rerouting it, right? Finding that. But we've proven to ourselves that we can do it. We know what it feels like. And we also believe it's important, right?
Sure.
So a very common strategy that sometimes gets simplified is the sense of, okay, imagine your friend is coming to you with his problems. What would you say to them, right? Let's practice on saying it to ourselves. I always tell people to start small, right? Start really, really small. Like when you're waking up in the morning and you're brushing your teeth and you're washing your face, how can you extend compassion, right? And maybe that's simply like, I'm grateful that I get the opportunity to choose to wash my face because I like having a clean face, right? That's so different than I have to do this or my acne won't go away, right? I have to do this or I'll smell bad. I'm grateful that I can do that and I am worth doing that. Same act. The tone of intentionality allows for the opportunity to pull that strength and to lean into it, right? I'm walking towards something as opposed to escaping something else.
Sure. Sure. I think that we covered a lot of good ground
I think
today.
it's
I
a good
hope that
spot.
all of our listeners got some tools that not only for them to consider, but that we motivated you to lean in into resilience and that grace that we talked about.
Absolutely. So thank you all for tuning into this month's edition of News Conscious Conversation. We hope that you were inspired, uplifted, and empowered. If you have any questions, reflections, or feedback, we definitely want to hear from you. Feel free to leave us a comment or reach out via email at contact@newcounselingpllc.com.
Thank you so much.
Take care.